Welcome to Rejected Religion Patreon, Tier 3, The Garden of Arcane Delights. I'm Stephanie Shea, and my guest this month is Ike Baker. Welcome, Ike.
Hi, Stephanie. Thank you so much for having me on.
It is a pleasure to be able to talk with you today. I was very happy to make your acquaintance a few months ago via a RENCEP Ask a Practitioner live meeting, and I learned then that you had a new book coming out. It's now available, and you kindly agreed to come and talk about it with me today, so thank you for that.
Yeah, great. Always looking for a chance to talk about this kind of stuff. So thanks for providing that opportunity.
Of course. The book is titled Ætheric Magic. Am I saying that word right? Ætheric?
Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. I didn't know if it was etheric, ætheric. Okay. Ætheric Magic, a complete system of elemental, celestial, and alchemical magic. So I think I'd like to start by asking you a bit about your background and what led you to write this book, and also who did you have in mind when you were writing this book?
Well, I'll start with the first part of that question.
Okay.
My background is, pertaining to the book and to, the question of magic. I am a senior initiate of the Cicero lineage of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. I am an administrator. I run the Asheville, North Carolina temple. As an administrator and a senior initiate, I also have to be a teacher. So I teach the outer order members, et cetera, and the junior members of the inner order. For anybody that's familiar with the structure of that kind of organization, it's my sort of purview to, deliver education. And a lot of this book came out of that, talking about, people are very, very interested in how to really get a hold on magic, especially when walking through the door and getting started. And there's this intersection of Eastern and Western, as we're all very familiar with, modes of spiritual practice. And as a matter of fact, that's also part of my background. So, that seemed like the easiest place for me to start. And so a lot of that had to do with what I had learned in Qigong, having gone to school also for Chinese medicine, acupuncture, Chinese herbalism, as well as I went to school for physiotherapy, physical therapy, massage therapy. Okay. So I have a really strong knowledge of the, bodily systems, and musculature, et cetera, skeletal, endocrine, what have you. And that really served me well when moving over to, or progressing in my studies to something like Chinese medicine. I didn't have to really build that knowledge base, and I could really focus on the energy theory. And when you go to school for stuff like that, it's required that you take classes in Tai Chi and Qigong, et cetera. So at a certain point, these two traditions I also actually studied with a private tutor for Qigong and martial arts, but also, some forms of what we call Taoist internal alchemy, Neidan. So having all that experience, I just kind of noticed, wow, these are the Western ceremonial thing and the Eastern energy systems are really two sides of the same coin. Truly. They're the dipoles of a full spectrum of this kind of esoteric practice, really. So that's where I began when I would teach students who came to me and said, what can I do? How does this work? What is something like the middle pillar exercise doing? What does it mean when we're, projecting energy around the room or towards certain ceremonial objects, talismanic objects? And so, I had a really strong theoretical understanding of a lot of that stuff, just from the completely accidental, synchronistic, I don't know what to call it, but the timing of having gone through the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and going to school specifically for acupuncture and Oriental medicine, it wasn't timed. I didn't really, there was very little intention behind it. It's just kind of, at that time in my life, I was allowing myself to be guided. I didn't really have a whole lot. I didn't know what magic was when I joined the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. I had never even heard of the order before I initially encountered it. They told me, well, before you initiate, make sure that you want to be a part of this. They gave me some books to read, etc. And even still, I was very skeptical, but my curiosity got the better of me. And it really turned out well, I think. This is what I do with my life now. But that was essentially the impetus for the book. Is over the course of 10 years, I was just like, we're not really talking about this. We're still somehow sequestering each of these traditions in their little bubbles and not allowing them cross communication. No one is really willing to do that work because of, I don't know what. I think there is a trepidation I find in modern authors that perhaps is prudent, but at the same time will keep us locked in this ever-shrinking little bubbles of study. That's too much nuance at a certain point. The instrument as a tool of analysis is just cutting things into so many pieces that it becomes impossible to view unity, to view, that panoramic style, oh, I see the forest for the trees type of thing. And so there's a trepidation for anybody to say anything conclusive or anything definite. And I think that byproduct of our systemic education is at a point where it's becoming tiresome and potentially, obstructive. So it's not like I discovered this stuff on a Wednesday and then on a Friday I started talking. I waited 10 years and I was offered a book deal. I wasn't like going around shopping my manuscript to publishers. But I decided, let me just do this, right? Llewellyn put it out. They're known for their practical, magical sort of tack, the way that they approach things. And then also their demographic is somebody who's going to be most likely very open-minded to what I had to say. So, yeah, I wrote the book. For the entire time I imagined myself when I first, not me personally, I didn't picture myself in my head, but the questions I had when I first was approaching that threshold of initiation. And as I mentioned, having read the books and still being skeptical, so I deferred to a lot because that's what I needed, right? Coming from this postmodern sort of, I went to many schools. I've been to vocational school, community college, private university, state university. I've been through that whole system. Yeah. And I saw that what it did to my mind is it installed these perceptual filters that I needed science to explain this stuff to me to make me a believer. And so I relied very heavily in the beginning of the book on some of that stuff, whereas I don't typically defer to, I don't need those two realms, those two domains of authority. I don't need them necessarily. They can communicate, but I don't need them to validate each other.
Okay. Yeah. I understand what you're talking about. And especially when you said about you actually were thinking of yourself when you were writing this book and asking the questions or trying to answer the questions in the book of the questions that you always had. This resonates really deeply with me as well because this project that I'm doing right now with my platform is basically I'm trying to do what I had always wanted to find when I was years and years ago, looking into all of this stuff. I wasn't formally studying any of this at the time, but I was so deeply interested in all of these topics within the umbrella of esotericism. Mm-hmm. And I was kind of lamenting of the fact that there wasn't really anything out there that would just, let's, have this resource where you have this person that just offers up all of these different ideas and these different perspectives and these different scholars, books, practitioners, So I think that is usually, if you have something in your life that you're so deeply passionate about, I think that that's probably why everything was just so synchronistic for you, that you said that I didn't ask for a book deal. I was just offered all of these things. It just, not that it happened overnight for you. You had to take 10 years to write the book, of course.
Yeah. Well, the time had to be ripe, I think.
Yeah, of course. But it wasn't a mistake. And you said that, all of these things that you were doing before, it wasn't like intentional, but you were just doing everything that you needed to be doing to lead you to this place. So I think there is something to be said for synchronicity there, as you mentioned before. So this book then can be used by people who are just starting out with a magical practice. They don't have to have any background in it, correct?
Correct. Okay. Yeah, they don't. Actually, I wouldn't say that's the case for this book. But in many instances, the less the less full of stuff your head is, the better when you're learning this kind of practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's not clashing. Like, oh, this other person
Exactly.
said this, and yeah, right. Okay.
Yeah, and that sort of internal struggle to like make it make sense when a lot of people don't realize, because the way that we're taught is you read about something, you learn it, you study it, then you go and do it, right? It's the same thing with me. I had to study for 4 years and then go to clinic for a year.
Yeah.
But that's not the case with magic. The phenomenology must be assimilated first, and you need to really, because of, there's various reasons, and we can talk about that.
Yes, well, this leads directly into my next question for you. As you well know, there is a lot of talk in our popular culture about what magic is and whether or not it is something that is quote unquote real. In other words, if it's something that can be used in a practical way to get real-time results. So what is your definition of magic? And how would you explain this to people who are either completely new to this concept or maybe, like you, had their doubts about it?
My definition of magic is always changing, maybe evolving. I don't really know. But certainly, like magic, my definition of it is a very personal thing. The one thing that's difficult for me is that I think a lot of times you'd have to really twist my arm to explain this to people who have their doubts about it, because I have no desire to convert anyone.
Right.
And I have no necessity for their validation of the subject.
Certainly.
Greater minds than ours have contributed extensively to this field of experience and knowledge. So I think my latest definition has to do with, I would say maybe magic is where the phenomenology of consciousness meets and interacts with metaphysical causality. In the universe, exteriorized. And that is to say, where consciousness meets where the subjective meets the objective. We play by a lot of rules, and many of those are self-imposed. And a lot of times it's out of necessity, but a lot of times it's also out of fear of the unknown. But I think that the more rules we make, a priori assumptions about reality and our place and experience in it, I think the smaller that reality will become. And I think a lot of what we are feeling, this unrest, this displeasure societally, has less to do with the outer trappings and more to do with the tiny, tiny cage we mentally find ourselves in. And then from there, everything else is symptomatic. It's just a symptom of that.
Yeah.
All the craziness is a symptom of the fact that we have put something which is very, very large into a really small box for a very long time now. So the phenomenology of consciousness and where it meets and interacts with material causality, this is essentially the common denominator between all forms of magic historically, right? And another thing that I would admonish the listener recall to mind is that these things are called the mysteries for a reason. We do not have to, quantify them, but we must experience them. And that's not, I'm not stripping inherent meaning out of there and saying it's all psychological. I don't believe that. Psychology is a tremendous part of this stuff, but it's not, it comes from that analytical. And if you say analysis to a lot of people, they think automatically, oh, well, I've got to think about it. But the archaic usage of the root of analysis is to take apart. Mm. And that's what we do with everything. We take it apart. So you're not really going to get a full picture of the thing if you just keep taking it apart and never put it back together. Like Agrippa is a really good example of, I think, where people can misread some of this stuff. Like occult virtues, he talks about them a lot, right? The virtutum occulti, right? So there's so much stigma and baggage that comes with the word occult that we forget its meaning, which is just hidden or not visible specifically to the eye. That doesn't mean not discernible, but not visible to the eye. So again, metaphysical causality, causes that you cannot see. And I'm not even of the opinion that some fin de siecle and early 20th century commentators and practitioners said, well, magic is just science that hasn't been discovered yet. I'm not sure that this qualifies as discoverable science. I think that the key to it is in the phenomenology and learning to stop constantly outsourcing the validity of your experience to a million different, sources exterior to yourself. And again, another big mistake in magical communities is to do exactly what I just said and then run with it, right? I channeled something and now I got to tell the world and I'm Chicken Little, the sky is falling. Don't do that either. It's like I said, have the objective and the subjective communicate with each other, right? To keep a sanity, mental hygiene. But at the same time, you don't need one to prevail over the other. The only reason cognitive dissonance exists is because we are literally entrapped, confined by this Cartesian dialectic that has been installed into us like a perceptual filter. It's like wearing a pair of contact lenses you're not even aware that you're wearing. So that would be what I had to say about, to people who have their doubts about it. Is that, of course you're going to have your doubts about it. You're stuffing something into your perceptual model of worldview. So of course, if I'm colorblind, there's certain things I'm not going to be able to see. It's effectively what we're doing when we dismiss things on a priori reductionist assumptions. We are poking one of our eyes out and then saying, well, like this over here in the left field of vision is the only thing that exists. Well, turn your head. But again, there's a lot of fear behind, opening that other eye a lot of the times, even for people who believe or want to believe, because there is that veil, right, that keeps things occult. And it's a serious consideration. So to that end, I'm very scrupulous about the type of magical practice that one should engage in the beginning stages. Right? So that you are at a disadvantage and you don't want to kind of unravel and you don't want to maybe toy with things that you don't know anything about and can't know anything about. So luckily I come through the Golden Dawn that has this really, really excellent system of guardrails that you're taught from day one. So I try to impart that in the book and in all of my work to people who are just getting into this for the first time. Good habits.
Yes. Thank you for that. I find your definition to be really thought-provoking. I like it.
Thank you. It's a good question.
So let's get into the book. Your book opens by discussing energy as well as what aether is. So maybe that's where we should start here. If you could expand on these before we go any deeper into the body and different levels of being and all of that. We're talking about energy. So maybe that's where we need to explore a little bit further.
Yeah. So, I started the book out on that foot for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. Right. Me, younger me, me of 15, 20 years ago, had all these questions about, what is this stuff? What is spirit, right? When we find it in Latin texts, spiritus and things like that. What is pneuma or pneuma when we find it in the Greek text? I don't understand. It's all crisscrossed. Is it soul? Is it spirit? I don't understand this. And that's, the sort of definition of terms is the first thing that has to be undertaken. You'll notice anybody that watches my YouTube channel where I produce, deep dive, long format documentary content on this stuff that is both scholarly and practice focused, I always start with a definition, but then I challenge that definition. And so that is essentially what I wanted to do in bringing up energy in the beginning of the book. I wanted to show people that the accepted scientific definition, at least at the time of writing the book, is that energy is the ability to do work, which tells us nothing about energy. So, but I hesitate to call it energy anymore, really, in my own conceptualization of it. But I do have to defer to the phenomenology of it, like the way it appears, because there's a physical component to it. I'm not imagining it. And when I teach it to other people, they're like, they can't even believe, I've gone my whole life and I've never seen this before. And also defer to the verbiage used by the ancients, particularly the Neoplatonists, the theurgists, right? It's a radiant luminosity. It is, as the Greeks called it, avoe di soma, right? The body of light. Especially when the luminous body, when you dive into that material and you allow yourself, rather than to sort of retrospectively interpolate their meanings, but you allow yourself to sit in the text and meet them on their terms, there's no reason to believe that they're speaking analogically.
Right.
You know, there's a literal component. Everything to them was a substance to some degree. So I would say that it is this radiant luminosity that we know exists, and not just in people, but in everything, every single thing. And there's been various methods developed over the years, some more trustworthy or reliable than others, to really distill this and make it more visible, more pronounced, ways of just looking at the etheric body, like Kilner screens, which are really cool. I mentioned them in the book. I think his book is called The Human Aura. It was written early 1900s, I think. So for anybody that's interested in that kind of imaging thing. But ultimately, there is a radiant luminosity that plays a part, specifically in forms of healing and traditional and magic, right? Traditional healing systems. We see it in things like shamanic traditions, where the shaman is not just a magician, he's particularly, first and foremost, a healer, which is why the book also deals a lot with healing, right? And self-care protocols and things like that, because it's all about balance. It's all about equilibrium. But then we also see it in something as sophisticated as Chinese medicine, where there's an entire theory behind this. And so what we find to be the most common descriptions from, you know, ancient literature on Chinese medicine to ancient literature on theurgy and theurgic work with the body of light to even more modern authors on the subject, like either Blavatsky or Eliphas Lewy and a whole host of other commentators, but those will likely be the most familiar to people interested in occultism. They talk about it as a liquid light. So Levy calls it a fluidic fire. He calls it, right, the azot, the magical agent, the agent that accomplishes all magic. Mesmer would call it, though he wasn't involved with magic, he was certainly involved with healing. And people like Levy, they based a lot of their understanding of this energy off of Mesmer's work. I mean, he was world famous. He broke ground. Yeah. And I mention it in the book, either in Ætheric Magic or my first book, A Formless Fire, which was much more of a history, but also gives the theory and practice of Western esoteric traditions. Mesmer really discovered the unconscious, right? We call it hypnotism now, but it was mesmerism until 50 years ago or 80 years ago. He discovered the unconscious, really. And when he put people in this unconscious state, he could heal them and make them do things and make them know things by using what he called the magnetic fluid. Yeah. You've got Levy, who is normally much in line with, the textual tradition of French occultism, extremely obscure. He conceals much more than he reveals. But we can thank him for being explicit this one time, perhaps, in this kind of rare translation that Arthur Edward Waite did. It's a pamphlet. It's very short in length. It's called The Science of Hermes, and he says that the magical agent, azot, is nothing less than magnetized electricity. Okay? And in TCM, you've got the acupuncture points conceived of as energetic, luminous water, where kidney 1, right, at the 2/3 from the base of the heel, about the center of the foot. They call that the bubbling spring. Okay, that's its English translation from Pinyin. CV6, which is the acupuncture point directly before what we call the lower dantian, right? The cauldron of elixir is the lower dantian. Well, CV6 they call the sea of qi. You have lung 11, which is on the anterior side of the cubital crease. They call that pool at the crook. So they're used, even in their verbiage, they're talking about it because it flows. There's a flow to it. There's an ebb and a flow to it. It's very interesting once you're able to observe it. So these are really the two main concerns that I have when describing, so that students of this system will be able to discern it, when they see it, and know that there's an objective component to this. There are similarities. There are things in common. It's not just however it occurs to you. And what's really interesting is I've done a few, I've been on a book tour. I've gone to London. I'm going to California next week. And I've styled the presentations more as workshops. And I have people do the preliminary exercises where they're learning to feel and sense that. Everybody says the same thing. People who haven't even read my book yet, it feels like there's water running through my fingers. So it's a very interesting thing to see it with large groups of students. I've only ever taught maybe 2 people at a time this stuff.
That is fascinating. Interesting how people are using these same keywords, even if they have really no foundation or background in any of this, that, you're finding that more regularly, that you're seeing that happen.
Yeah.
Very interesting, but also I think indicative that these principles are kind of eternal. It's not like something that just was made up by somebody. So very interesting.
Right.
I appreciated the way in which you explained the life force energy of a person, as well as the different levels of being, because as you pointed out, and you mentioned this already today, many people confuse the terms such as spirit and soul and aura and astral and all these terms that are out there floating around. Mm-hmm. So what I especially liked was the way you linked the terminology as well. For example, the Egyptian energy system that you talk about in the book, wherein the Ka, or the life force, or the vital essence of a person, resides in the Ba, or the soul, and further how the Ba then corresponds to the astral level, and the Ak, or immortal divine spark of a person, corresponds to the spiritual level. Now, perhaps that sounded very confusing to the listener, so maybe it would be a good idea for you to talk more about this body level correspondence and where then the etheric level fits into this schema, because I think it's really important what you're doing, that in order for you to practice something, you need to really understand all of these terms. As you said before, if you don't know what it is that you're working with and know what to call it, then it's kind of futile to get into any type of practical work. So I really liked this. So if you could maybe expand a little bit on this.
Yeah, at the deeper levels of practice, you must know what you're talking about. Or you must know what you're talking to. Yeah. But one of the things that was interesting to me about the Egyptian conception, the parts of the soul, that matches actually, it graphs on pretty well Kabbalistically to the parts Sufim of Kabbalism, particularly the arrangement of it, the parts of the soul in the Hermetic Kabbalah, is that these things are essentially nested. Again, we have to analysis. We have to take these things apart so that we can understand what they are as discrete, but we must bring them back together, because ultimately, much like the ontological hierarchies, of Iamblichian theurgy or Proclean theurgy, or like the Hystalschluss of the Kabbalistic schools, these things are collapsible. They're like accordions. They have a contraction and an expansion. So I want people to really think of these as nested, which is what I enjoy about the Egyptians kind of conceiving the Ka residing in the Ba, and that residing in the different bodies, the Ak, and ultimately the Kaibit, right? And then on death, they kind of separate. So the ontological chain begins to withdraw.
Yeah.
If we want to think of it as a verticality, it withdraws from the bottom and recedes back up. Now, again, these are analogies, right? It's the only way we can talk about them.
Yeah.
But the bodies and the levels are essentially a very neat and convenient pedagogical method or diagrammatic way of talking about these discrete parts of the ontological hierarchy or the ontological architecture of both physical, mental, emotional, and metaphysical selfhood. They were most neatly organized in the theosophical literature. But what I want people to understand in particular is that this is just a way for us to talk about it. And this is, again, in practice where I think a lot of people get hung up. I'm going to use 2 analogies. So the first would be music. I was a musician for many, 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 many years. That was like my past life. You spend all these years learning scales and rudiments and all that stuff. But I mean, do you think that that's not what's going on in our head when we're playing?
No.
Right? Because there has to be this flow and this exchange and this kind of simultaneity and at the same time spontaneity. But we've ingrained all those things. And that allows us to exercise a level of freedom. And now on the other hand, right, so we stratify the bodies into these discrete levels, the physical, the etheric, the astral. The astral is usually associated with the emotional components, or like the desire-bound part of the soul, if you're thinking of it platonically. And then there's the lower and higher mental, and then the lower and higher spiritual. But in reality, all of these things are completely interwoven. When I was in school for PT, physical therapy, and massage therapy, you have your myology classes, the study of musculature. And you learn about these discrete muscle groups, agonist, antagonist, all this kind of, but you never, then like third year, they take you to your first cadaver lab. And you're looking, it's like, I don't know what is going on. Everything is complete. It's nothing like the way it was taught, but they had to teach it that way. I get it. But you'd have to spend a lot of time. Human musculature is so incredibly interwoven. And there are variations in all different types of anatomy. So that's the difference between the sort of pedagogical state and then the phenomenology, the practice of it. So that's what's really important. Now, the etheric serves as a midpoint. And anybody who's familiar with like Proclean theurgy, Iamblichian theurgy, is going to be very familiar with this sort of the way that things are stratified in triads. You have a lower level and a higher level and a level in between which connects them. Very much like, right, we have the noetic level in theurgy, which is sort of the divine mind. We have the noeric level, which is the personal nous. And then you have the noetic that connects them. Well, the etheric is an extremely rarefied physical luminosity that also, it connects body to the astral, or what we would call, if we're using, Henri Corbin's terminology, or somebody like Jung, the imaginal.
Right.
So a lot of people think, I use the term radiant luminosity because that's the way it appears, but there's some discrepancy over, the mechanical origination of this stuff. Is it radiating out of the body, or is it condensing the body into form? Which way is it working? Not really important. What's important is to understand that there is a communication between the imaginal and the emotional and the etheric and the physical body through the etheric. And I think one of the best phenomenological components to this is synesthesia. When you hear a piece of music and you are emotionally stirred, and, for instance, I'll get goosebumps, and it'll feel like static electricity on my arms, and from something I'm hearing and an emotion I'm feeling, and it's generating an image or a color in my head, in my mind's eye, I should say. Yeah. And this sort of symphony of experience and phenomenology is exactly how all of this stuff works. So the key component is that the etheric is something that we've kind of tuned out. And so the beginning of this book are ways in which you can tune it back in, or tune back into it, and therefore not have this apparently or ostensibly acausal relationship between these emotional states and what's going on in your physical body. And it feels like there's no control. I get into the control of the mental diet, the curation of the mental diet and the physical, which is really important for that link. But yeah, so that's about as high as I go in this book. I talk about the physical, astral, and the linking etheric, but they are definitely linked. And the thing is, it's like the etheric component is never static. It doesn't just dissolve because you're not mentally directing it. And that's how you direct it, mentally. There's a saying in Qigong practice, where the mind goes, the Qi flows. The thing is, if we want to use the verbiage or the way of looking at it that the early 20th century occultists like Dion Fortune or Israel Regardie would have talked about it, it's always receiving impressions. It's always receiving impressions. Sometimes, Agrippa even talks about it. If there's a particularly vicious crime, violent crime committed in a place, it will be communicated to the intuition of the person by way of feeling, but he says specifically through the air or the ether. So there's that kind of, again, that communication that we're entirely unaware of. If you can tune back into this stuff and make your latent, in most cases, completely latent, impressionable etheric field active, there's a lot that you can accomplish, not just in ceremonial practice, but in life. And at a certain point, it becomes an inexhaustible source of energy, almost inexhaustible.
Very interesting. I like the way you have explained all of that. And I like the idea that there's this something that in my life has something to do with this imaginal place, non-place, nowhere, no place. That is such a theme in my life for some reason. So I guess I'm continually surprised, but then not surprised that whenever I talk to people, that this always comes up, because it's just like this red thread that just keeps going through all of my discussions with people. And I'm so happy that you brought this up, because it's such a fascinating topic, number one. But I think it's so important that people start to learn more about this.
Oh, yeah.
The mundus imaginalis, the imaginal.
Yes.
This
Exactly.
it always keeps coming up, and I'm so happy that you brought this up. So anyway, I won't keep going on and on.
We can. I got a lot to say about that. It's a power of the soul.
Yeah.
It's the way, anything that was created by human beings was imagined first.
Yeah.
So, it's truly a power of the soul.
Agreed. All right. Well, maybe that would be a topic for another discussion that we could have about the mundus imaginalis. But keeping with the talking points here, the second chapter of the book, you talk about alchemy. In your opinion, why is this understanding of working with the four elements plus this quintessence or aether necessary for a magical practice?
Well, I kind of talk about it in the book, is that all true traditions of what I would call theurgic or initiatory magic require initiation. Now, some people might be thinking that that's an interpolation, but there's really no better place to look if you're into esotericism in Western civilization than the theurgic school of Iamblichus. And later, right, he creates this curriculum it's later called the Ladder of Virtues, and it's the curriculum of Iamblichus, comprised of 12 dialogues of the Platonic tradition. And so, along with the reading and the pursued dialectic regarding the dialogue, you're supposed to cultivate specific virtues. And we don't mean virtues in a strictly ethical or moral sense, but certain powers, certain faculties that, as they're arranged vertically, because as you start, it's innate, physical. You go up and it's ethical. You go up and it's civic. So you're kind of moving outward. And then you hit the philosophical virtues, like contemplative virtue, paradigmatic. Now, instead of going out horizontally, you're going vertically. So you were supposed to essentially embody these 6 virtues before you could become the theurgist. And, that 7th virtue that Iamblichus added to the others that were really kind of culled from a combination of Plotinus and Porphyry's work is hieratic. Okay, so that's when you're doing the magic. It's the same thing in the Golden Dawn. The Golden Dawn, the outer order, you're in for like 5 to 10 years, and you don't do any magic. You do the LBRP, the lesser banishing ritual, the lesser invoking ritual, the middle pillar. They're not high voltage. Actually, they're important, right? You wouldn't want like an apprentice electrician working with a tremendous voltage, right? To kind of get their shocks out early on, make their mistakes in a safe setting. It's the same concept. But what's happening is you go through elemental initiations in the Golden Dawn, right? And these are attributed to the lower 4 Sephiroth on the Tree of Life, each one earth, air, water, and fire, respectively. And so this enacts a solve et coagula formula as best as it can on the initiate. And this is where it does become very psychological. But you are, as Agrippa and many other commentators have said, you cannot completely extract one element from all the others in earth. But in terms of our spiritual analogy here, you can bring one to the fore. And that's essentially what we're doing. We're bringing a single element psychologically, sort of subsumed in this fourfold elemental system. So the earth component would be your body, your physical finances, where you live, even like what car you drive, who you're dating, the circumstances of physical life. Air then would have to do with, it manifests a lot of times in the phenomenology of practitioners as an irritability, as an inability to focus, but also there is a component there of dreams and memories. Water then would usually have something to do with the emotional life, but also the reflective capacity of the intellect. And then fire would have to do with creativity, courage, passion, self-expression, that kind of stuff. So this sort of pulling apart of the psychology and putting it back together, there's, a strictly psychological purpose, which is to know thyself and to see how the microcosm of the self is definitely elemental. Because when we talk about the elements, right, in alchemy, we talk about the elements of the wise. We're not talking about discrete Empedoclean elements. We're talking about the essences which the terrestrial manifestations of these are but special examples. So you have those essences in yourself, and if you do not equilibrate them, bad things can happen. So that's why the alchemical process has to be undergone. But it also has another component to it, which, again, the more, I would say, reductionist or positivist listeners or commentators, they might balk at this. But, we are, after all, talking about etheric energy. And there are various unconscious patterns of behavior, which we call habits. We can also call them complexes, which means there's a stimulus that triggers you, and it just fires off. You're as I think, so I feel, so I act in a predictable, repetitious pattern that you're not even aware of. So we talked about this emotional, imaginal connection to the etheric energy in the body. When those things happen, it can feel, right? I mean, anybody who's gone through that, it feels like you're being constricted. It's a very constricting feeling emotionally. Your chest gets tight. You get a lump in your throat. Yeah. Sometimes you get really angry and you ball up your fists. There's a lot of constriction. Yeah. What's happening is that energy that could be used for something else is working in the same loop, like a whirlpool, and it is not available. It doesn't become available for magical work, health, even mental capacity. You'll find a lot of people who reach the upper stages of the alchemical initiation, and they can draw. They've never been able to draw before. People can learn languages, and they didn't even speak English that well when you met them, and they become polyglots. There's more mental, astral etheric energy that becomes available as you go through and untangle these things. Now, are you supposed to end up this perfected human being after the end of 5 years, 10 years? No. But it's not necessarily about perfection. It's about progress. Yeah. And then once you've enacted that cycle, you can continue it, right? Alchemy works on several circulations. You don't just do it once. You do it a whole bunch of times. Yeah. So that is why it's extremely important, because when you begin consciously awakening your ether and bringing it under the dominion of conscious control, which the mind is, let's say, it's conscious, it's bright. In a lot of systems like Kabbalah and the Tarot, the sun as a luminary is associated with the conscious mind, where the moon is associated with the unconscious mind and mental imagery. And what do we say about how that's linked by the etheric? So the etheric is latent and the consciousness is active. And as long as they're unaware of each other, there's this kind of disjuncted function of the organism. So the consciousness bringing the etheric field under conscious control, I sort of call it a lesser conjunction of Sol and Luna, an active and a passive. And you create that, alchemical Mercury, that rebus of holism in the self. So there's a lot of alchemical symbolism that can be said. And just to clarify for anybody, I'm not necessarily talking about laboratory alchemy in this book.
Right. Okay. Yes, this should be noted.
Yeah.
I like, though, the way that you include all of this. Of course, these different concepts, these different streams, currents are interconnected in so many ways. And for anyone who is interested in spiritual alchemy, if somebody has a background in this, it's very then easy to plug into your book to understand what it is that you're talking about. Because, you do have to take it apart and purify everything first and then put it back together. Yeah, and this can be then represented very, as you said, very beautifully in our just daily life. If we have all of these bad habits, or we have all of these, I guess we could call it just the basic terms, all the baggage that we're carrying around with us.
Yeah.
That, I don't really like the word trigger, but, we get triggered by all these things. And then all these reactions happen and we don't even have any grip on it. It just happens out of, like people say, I didn't have any control over that. It just happened. It just occurred.
Right.
So I like the way that you're talking about this in very practical terms and very pragmatic terms, and still bringing in all of the, quote unquote, esoteric, more hidden aspects, and really melding and meshing these together very, very beautifully, I think, so that people can understand this. It's not all of this, vague, very high language. It's something that, I can really get into this, and I really appreciated that.
Well, as I expressed, that's exactly what bothered me early on going through the French stuff, the French occult literature. It's all foreplay, and it's like, well, come on, say something for God's sake. And so I myself, coming from this, as I mentioned before, this kind of academic generation, tell me something about this. It's already out there. The information, people are going to be doing this. One of the things that was my biggest kick in the butt to get out here and start talking was that I was going on Reddit threads, and like teenagers were doing Ætheric Magic, summoning demons for things like that. I'm like, okay, all right, well, there's another way. Let me go talk about that. And that's, again, to your point, that can be, if you don't even believe in the other stuff. I don't encourage you to join an esoteric order if you don't believe in the metaphysical. We're not here to make you believers.
No.
But if you're curious and open-minded, go ahead. But if you take nothing else from it, right, it's like Carl Gustav Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will control your life and you will call it fate.
Right.
So what is the theurgist? The master of fate. So you must untangle these knots. Otherwise, you can get involved with things that are way over your head. I mean, I could get anecdotal about this, but I don't think I will.
Okay, I respect that. You brought this up earlier about the different names that people have given this energy, this etheric energy, and you mentioned mesmer with animal magnetism. But another thing that it was so, sometimes when I read things and, people like you who write books and you bring all these different things together, and I'm like, why didn't I think of that? Why wasn't my brain firing and saying, this is all the same thing? Because you talk about other people who've also written about this energy and
a lot of them.
And what they call it. They call it all these different names. And I'm reading through all of these things and I'm like, yes, I've heard of that. Yes, I've heard of that. Yes, I know what that is. Yes. And I'm like, and I never made the link that that's what etheric energy is. And it's so, then I just feel like a big dunce. But anyway, enough about my stupidity. If you could talk a little bit more about these different names that are out there that probably will ring bells in the listeners' heads as you talk about it.
Obviously, there's a bunch, right? We have the animal magnetism or the magnetic fluid of Mesmer and his whole group, because he taught several students how to utilize that. And he found that this is the only way he could describe it. It felt like there was some kind of magnetism going on. And again, the phenomenology of it, a lot of times you'll see this in Qigong groups early on. The practitioners, you're all together in a room. You've got one sifu, teacher who's kind of going through it all. And you'll all of a sudden either get this feeling like your arms or your hands are being involuntarily repelled, or like they're being attracted to each other. And there's this component where if you've ever taken two magnets, in like grade school, and it feels exactly like that.
Yeah.
And it like exactly like that. And you're just standing there like, I am not doing this. But the thing is now, if that happened for a very small percentage of people, it would be like, okay, maybe it's psychosomatic, but it's almost reliable 100% of the time that at some point, if you look at modern mesmerists, there's some videos on YouTube, and even in my own experiments with my fiance, who actually doesn't know anything about a lot of this stuff, it's completely disinterested, which is great because then I have like a variable here. I've got somebody who's not biased, will feel like I need to raise my arm or something it's not even like I am lifting my arm. It's that my arm is being pushed away.
Yeah.
So he called it animal magnetism because it was associated specifically with the body and the deep parts of the brain and the unconscious, as we mentioned before. And he could get people to do things and say things, much like hypnotism. I mean, he discovered that was him. It was called mesmerism. So it was also a vital force. It was the force of life. And that's essentially, right, what prana and qi mean? The life force. But they also mean breath, wind, or vapor. The Chinese character for the word qi is steam rising off a pot of rice. So then you look at somebody like Henri Bergson, who talks about the élan vital, that vital force. Now, a lot of people don't know this about Bergson, is that his sister was Mina Bergson, who married Samuel Mathers and became Moina Mathers, who was the first initiate and probably the greatest unofficial chief of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. She was the paradigm of Golden Dawn initiation. She created the color system, and she had many wonderful and fascinating things to say. You've got Orgon and things like that, which have been kind of smeared, that people don't want to address. So I don't talk about any of that, the philosophy or ideology behind that, but just mention, look, this is another iteration of his pot. It's rearing its head on the historical record. And then Levy's Azot, which I'm not saying anything definitive about Azot itself as it's written in medieval alchemical texts. But Levy thought that the Azot, the magical agent, was this magnetized electricity, as he was explicit about. In other systems like the Golden Dawn, they'll say project a ray of force. What they do is another reason why alchemy is important to this. What they do is they conceive of, and a lot of people get the ideas mixed up between akasha and prana. It's like, well, which one is which? Well, akasha is the void. And we know that there's really not a void anywhere. Everything is filled. And that's a Rosicrucian axiom, right? Ne quaquam vacuum, from the manifestos. Nowhere a void, nowhere a vacuum. The akasha is the space. And then what permeates it is the prana. And then the prana manifests as 4 discrete types: fire, air, earth, and water, or those essences. It's like the canvas and colors spontaneously emerging from the canvas rather than being painted onto them. And in the tattva system that we're talking about, that's Prithvi, Tejas, Apas, and Vayu. So again, those are all terms for this stuff. And that's actually how we work with it, is that we use theurgic ceremonial and visualization to bring forth one element to the exclusion of others. They're present in the background, but one is being brought to the fore. That's magic. I mean, that's what Agrippa says. Agrippa is explicit about that. If you can separate the volatile from the fixed and discover these properties without altering the form of something, you'll be capable of what he called the miraculous, right? So there's Shamayim as well, which I believe I have Manly Palmer Hall situated it in this context of ether, because he's talking about the waters of creation. And we talked about Shamayim is a combination of the words Esh and Mayim, which is fire and waters. It's a plural with the I-am at the end. So waters of fire are fiery waters. And in the Chaldean oracles, actually, there is a reference to this that we use in ceremonial. And when after all the phantoms have been banished, thou shalt see that holy and formless fire, that fire which darts and flashes through the hidden depths of the universe. So there's this kind of, again, that pranic substrate that we're talking about there. Right. So, and I think one of the reasons people don't kind of see this stuff is because, again, the analytical, as I've defined that term, analytical perceptual filter, because I couldn't see it either, because I'm like, oh, what does the Vedic stuff got to do with, the Empedoclean elements? And it's like, it's because my brain was so used to putting things in, right? I've become so Aristotelian about everything. The categories were so infinite and important. There's such an emphasis on categorization that I'm completely abstracting myself from the experience of being a human. And so part of initiation is the rectification of that. And so I had some form of mystical experience. I had some familiarity and experience with energy, but it wasn't until the end of that alchemical initiation, that first run of things through the elements, that I began to see with clarity, and then you see that we've thrown out the baby with the bathwater with an ancient worldview, because they were actually more concerned with things that were expressions in the material universe of a more profound truth than we currently are willing to acknowledge exists.
Can you give an example of that?
I think it's a perfect example would be in like traditional Chinese medicine or classical Chinese medicine. So we've mentioned about how they phrase the different points on the meridian system. They talk about them as if they are pools, ponds, seas, inlets, rivers, tributaries. Now, the entire organism of the body is thought of as a landscape. One landscape containing many different types of topography. There's swampy areas, there are desert areas, and those things are fine if that is their inherent disposition, if that's the way that they're supposed to be, according to the Tao, we would say that is their qi.
Right.
It is the kidney's qi to be damp. It is the stomach's qi to be, etc. That's what they do. Now, it's when those environments, when a desert becomes cold or when a marsh begins to dry out, now we're having problems. And so they use this analogy because they learned it from the mirror of nature. They use this analogy to say, well, water controls fire. Or they have the Wu Jing, which I talk about. It's not our elemental system because it's based specifically on this landscape sort of archetype, right? It's fire, earth, metal, water, wood. So we know metal controls wood because we can chop wood up with metal. Right. We know that fire controls metal because that's how we smelt and make blades. So they're using this organization of controlling, generating, and insulting, which is, the generation cycle is that fire creates earth, right? Because when something goes on fire, it turns into potash and it settles into the ground and it becomes fertilizer. Earth creates metal because we find the minerals. So all of this symbolic stuff, it might not adhere to or make itself agreeably confined to what we understand as modern science. But there's a symbolic truth to it that is more profound than the nuts and bolts of things. And that's why these systems worked for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And that's why they continue to work enough where people are using it and healing from it.